What do you think the role of the disclosure, for example, for China? What China's role might be in disclosure?
Let's focus on two countries here. Let's focus on China and Russia. There is a fourth country, India. But it's a very different case. And while I'm trying to get some contacts there, I can't quite put India in a position that Russia can. It is a nuclear power. It does have a lot of people. But it doesn't have the kind of power and impact that China and Russia have. And, of course, the United States. For the length of this truth embargo, certainly the first part, which ran from 47 through 91, the Cold War, 44 years, all of the Western countries that were the allies of the United States during World War II simply fell in line behind the truth embargo. The United States was well thought of after World War II. We had made good contributions to ending that war. On the other hand, Russia made extraordinary contributions to ending that war, which had never been properly recognized by the West. So they can certainly appreciate that when you go through something like that, your allies are going to be pretty thankful. And so when the U.S. basically said to its allies, through its intelligence committees or through its intelligence operations, the ET thing must remain embargoed, and we want you on board. And they said, fine. Because after all, the U.S. is the nation that had the power to, quote, contain the Soviet issues. The Cold War might have been avoided, but it happened. And so the Western countries lined up. But Russia and China were not really part of that group. I mean, Russia ended up an ally of the United States, but it was temporary, as we know. Both nations were at each other's throat almost regularly. The reasons, I think, are fairly straightforward. The Soviet Union and Communist China, which is still Communist China, though obviously much different than the Communist China before 1990, were what are called ideological states, high control ideological states, in which the cohesion of the nation is very much dependent upon kind of very strict allegiance to kind of state view. And the truth is that within that context, the idea of a Communist China leader or a Soviet leader coming out and saying, oh, by the way, there's extraterrestrials here, we've known about it for years, they have amazing technology. This is not going to, getting back to a question you made earlier, this is going to make it a lot more difficult to control the citizen of the nation within the context of that kind of government. I don't think this is not hard. I mean, that's not really rocket science at all. But, obviously, that's not the case now. Something extraordinary happened between 1989 and 1992 that Americans just really don't get, and they're not taught it. And that is that after 44 years and somewhere between 15 and 20 to 25 trillion dollars spent between two nations that were in direct conflict and on the edge at any moment of complete annihilation, one of those nations, a republic like the United States, made the decision to step back from that Cold War, to let 14 of its republics, a huge, well, certainly in terms of population, huge amount of their national structure, not so much territory, but certainly in population, let them go, outlaw their primary party, the governing party, and embrace not only the economic modality of its mortal enemy, the United States and the West, but also the political modality, and did it with a minimum of bloodshed. This is extraordinary. You look back in history, this just doesn't happen. And thus began the transformation of Soviet Union to Russia. Obviously, Russia is in a totally different place 26 years after the end of the Cold War than it was prior to that. Every young person in this country that's 26 years or younger has lived their entire life after the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in China, more complicated. China went through extraordinary financial reform, but elected to maintain much more societal political control. And as a result, I think it's more conflicted about taking a step of this magnitude. Though, as the oldest, I think, current civilization, India can make a claim to this too. It's certainly, if not the oldest, one of the oldest. With an incredibly long history and a huge population. If I were Xi Jinping, I would certainly consider taking that legacy and giving it to my people. The legacy of being the disclosure head of state. I do not think, at this point, it would significantly disrupt Chinese political government. It probably would cause it to open up some more. So that's my feeling about China. Now let's talk about Russia. A much different situation there. Russia, as I indicated, was the result of an absolute extraordinary act on the part of the Soviet government and its last leader. It resulted in the end of at least the worst of the Cold War. Unfortunately, the United States did not prove to be a very good winner. It's said, and I was a tennis player once and an athlete, and it said that in terms of sportsmanship, a bad winner is a worse sportsman than a bad loser. A bad loser is disappointed and angry because they lost. A bad winner is doing that purely out of arrogance. So the United States made a decision, or a range of decisions, that rather than allow this transition, this incredibly difficult transition that Soviet to Russian history was going to take, that they would put their foot down and hold it back, intimidate, create fear. Huge mistake. And it has helped to prevent Russia from being even more advanced and successful than it is now. But that's not going to last. Russia is inevitably going to achieve extraordinary new gains as this new generation more vigorously embraces the reforms and transition that's underway. Now, the man that has had the principal responsibility of bringing Russia completely into the 21st century, without question, is Vladimir Putin, President Putin. Certainly, Medvedev has been a very important role. obviously the president for a while. But clearly, this is Putin's era. And in the United States, I have done, well, and outside the U.S., but overall since 1997, I've done over 1,200 interviews on the subject of the extraterrestrial presence. I don't talk about UFOs, really. I talk about the extraterrestrial presence and the politics of the truth embargo. And on scores and scores of occasions, I have specifically brought up my intrigue as to why President Putin did not take this legacy in the 26 years since the end of the Cold War and make the announcement to be the disclosure president. I sort of understand it, of course, but given that the nation and the head of state that makes the first initial confirmation of the ET presence will achieve an extraordinary historical legacy, almost impossible really to measure at this point, that nation will immediately move to the center of the stage in the view of the world's people, will be elevated to an exceptional stature as the bringer of what will be the most profound transition in history. This is an incredibly valuable opportunity. Now, I had 2 minutes with President Putin. I would only have time, and I would ask one question, and that would be, what is the reason you elected, because not to inform the Russian people about the ET presence, and I'm fully convinced, and very few of my colleagues would disagree, that Vladimir Putin is well aware of the extraterrestrial presence. If not only for the reason that, remember I talked about the constitutional breach in the United States, where the military intelligence industrial complex is elected to pull a number of programs out from under the proper oversight of the executive branch, which is illegal. There isn't a constitutional breach in Russia. There is no member of the Russian intelligence services or the Russian military that would even think for a second to tell President Putin, we really can't talk about that, sir. You don't have a need to know. I don't think so. I think he can have whatever he wants in that area. He can be briefed to whatever degree he wants, and he can visit any facility that's ever been put together. And so he knows, but he's chosen not to do it. Fine. If I were asked, why do you think, Steve, that President Putin has allowed this embargo to continue, an embargo that the United States began and cannot seem to end? There are a number of factors. One of the most important, I believe, is the fact that Russia, without question, is very much dependent, certainly relies on its vast resources, natural resources, to grow, develop, and deal with whatever comes its way. And included in those resources is oil and gas, and to some degree coal. It has a lot of it, and it's selling it, and it wants to sell more. And I'm quite sure that President Putin is aware not only of the extraterrestrial presence, but is aware of the re-engineering and research going on ET-derived technology, and may very well be aware of that same research happening within Russia. And going back to the Soviet Union, which was doing psychic research. And a number of your members of your military have referred to the fact that there were studies going on in this phenomenon. Which means that he would understand that disclosure of the ET presence would almost certainly end up bringing these technologies forward. Now, anti-gravitic propulsion is not particularly a threat, or not particularly a problem for, I think, Russia's economic considerations. But energy paradigm shift is a different matter. If the energy systems of these craft are as good as we think they are, they will create a paradigm shift in civilization unlike anything we've seen. And what do I mean by that? Simple. The number one commonality between virtually everything that humans do and make and consume is the cost of energy. When energy goes up in price, it affects virtually everything that humans do, make, and consume. And it puts pressure on the entire global society. An energy paradigm shift of what we think is coming will mean that the cost of generating an electron, pushing it up a wire, may drop to a penny on the dollar. Meaning 99 cents, 99%. And will be pollution free, basically. Meaning the end of fossil fuels. Naturally, if I'm the leader of Russia, I would think about that seriously. Boy, what are we going to do? And if I'm Saudi Arabia, I'd be thinking the same way. And by the way, Saudi Arabia has been making a number of maneuvers lately, in which they have fully stated, these are huge maneuvers on the part of Saudi Arabia, and some of these other Gulf states, that they're looking beyond, you see, beyond the fossil fuel era. They're diversifying. Well, technically, there's enough fossil fuels out there, always understated by the industries, because they want the price to be as high as possible. So they'll tell you it's very rare, when in fact they know differently. What beyond are they thinking about? I mean, so that the Saudi Arabians are thinking, well, we need to plan for 100 years from now. Obviously, they must think something's going on, something that may accelerate this a lot quicker. But that's them, right? Very limited population, small countries. Vladimir Putin has to run a massive country, huge in size, with very large numbers of people. But what I would point out is that this transition is not going to be overnight. It's going to take a good deal of time for all of the fossil fuel generating capacities to be converted over to what could be a ground state energy systems. And based upon what we know about ground states and space, the amount of energy that can be pulled out is virtually unlimited and cheap. But it's still going to take time. Time to adjust. Time to diversify. And then this is the key point that I would pass on to any leader of any nation. Whatever you think you might lose by not being able to sell some oil and gas and maybe some coal, you will get back tenfold, because a major energy breakthrough derived from extraterrestrial technology, producing energy at 1 cent on the dollar, will open up a vast ocean of viable technological developments that previously were not possible when energy was here, but are now highly doable when energy is here. Not to mention the impact on human beings, because energy that cheap makes it possible to solve what is coming at us like a freight train, which is the water crisis. And those that want to learn about that, they're going to have to Google it and study it, because they're not going to hear it from their politicians. This is an incredibly serious, dangerous matter, and politicians don't like to talk about things like that. And so they leave it to think tanks and the CIA to put out occasional reports, which if you read them are like nightmares. They're like living nightmares. Wars over water are heading towards us right now. And millions, if not hundreds of millions of people are going to die. But if you have an energy paradigm shift like that, you have then the ability to build steam distillation plants all over the world and generate vast quantities of fresh water at very little cost Problem solved. But you can't do it now. Why aren't we doing it now? Because the cost of energy is too high and we can't afford to make that fresh water. But aside from that, technological growth and expansion that any advanced nation possesses, which certainly includes Russia, would be profound. And the economic input down the line would be many times whatever economic benefit would come from selling those resources, which in the case of oil and gas requires vast pipelines traveling thousands of miles or thousands of miles of pipelines under the ground. Cost a fortune to make. Terrorists can blow them up anytime they want. These are thoughts in my mind. That is one of the principal things that, if I had to guess, that would prevent a leader like Vladimir Putin from holding back. There is probably still a residual concern that there are still plenty of nukes out there, and there's brinksmanship going on, and that announcing an ET presence might be a disturbance in the force. It could create unpredictable outcomes. I would turn that around. I would say that without a profound change of focus, without a profound alteration in the global worldview, we're almost certainly going to go over the brink. And if it's not a mistaken war that emerges out of a conflict, which could be Korea, which we just played brinksmanship with just 2 weeks ago, it could be in the Middle East, but from simply a nuclear terrorist attack. The policies of nations since the end of, certainly, the World War II and the Korean War, and I'm including most nations here, I'm not singling anybody out, have generated the largest army of terrorists the world has ever seen. And it's not because they're bored and got nothing to do. It's because their nations are being destroyed, their people are being bombed and killed, family members, women, children, water plants, schools, whatever. And they get angry. So angry that thousands and thousands of them are committing themselves to suicide attacks. Let me tell you something about suicide attacks. In World War II, which the Soviet government and the United States government were ultimately allies, the thing that scared our military, which was a formidable military, the most were the kamikazes. Absolutely terrified them. The kamikazes were the first guided missiles. And so in the last days of that war, the last many months of that war, Japanese zealots were getting into planes, had bombs in them, and flying them right into our ships. They damaged over 200, some score. Scared the hell out of them. Let me tell you something about the kamikazes. The reason that the kamikaze attacks finally stopped is not because they ran out of Japanese willing to kill themselves, but because they ran out of planes. Well, now, the policies of nations since the end of the Korean War have created a vast kamikaze suicide force that doesn't need planes, and their numbers continue to grow. And if they get their hands on a nuclear weapon or a tactical shell or whatever, they are going to use it. And the number one target is Washington, D.C. Not Moscow, though it's on the list. Washington, D.C. And if that happens, what then? Well, Russia and the world saw what happened when, apparently, some middle-class young men decided to kill themselves by flying planes into some of our buildings, and they killed about 3,300 Americans. The first attack on American soil, really. in the history of warfare. I mean, well, since the War of 1812, the modern era. We were angry about that. Okay. So we responded. We didn't go and kill 3,000 people. We went and killed hundreds of thousands of people. We set the entire Middle East on fire, which launched the biggest diaspora since World War II. A refugee crisis that threatens all of Europe and could undo the European Union and is putting tensions on multiple countries, creating coups, and could go bad at any time. So what will be the response of the United States if a terrorist is able to get a nuke in a van and drive it on the mall and set it off, and probably will be happy to sit in a van when he pushes the button? I can't even measure what that response will be. And so my message to all of the heads of states of nation is that you need to change the subject pretty damn quickly. Because if you think changing the subject in that profound a way is somehow going to create a higher risk, you're wrong. We're already in high risk. In fact, this is more likely to happen if we do not start telling the truth to the world's people. Now, the level of paranoia and distrust now is virtually epidemic. And the efforts of some people to try to puncture, to penetrate these national security structures, which we need, the pushback, is even deepening that paranoia. Why? Because these efforts still don't achieve resolution. So we had the church committees, we had the church investigation, we had the Iran-Contra investigations and committees in Congress, and then it disappeared. There's the dump, the WikiLeaks dump of the Iraq documents, and then it disappears. And Snowden puts out 500,000 documents and opens up some of the things going on in that world, that black world, and then it fades. Assange puts out more documents, but he's pinned down in the Ecuador embassy. People are calling for his arrest and the execution of all of them. But these glimpses, which have not led to resolution, have just made the people even more paranoid, more distrustful. Trust in government is collapsing in the United States. Trust in media is collapsing. And so, when a number of heads of state of nations, by virtue of the fact they have air forces, and all the major countries do, and those air forces are tasked to go up and intercept these craft, or at least monitor them, and when they send those planes up, they have cameras in them, and they film them. Because if you're going to go up and intercept a bogey that's crossed into your territory, and you may end up shooting it down, and it ends up being a French airliner, you better have some evidence of what took place there. And so gun camera footage of these things has been taken by nations for the last 60 years, and not one foot of it has ever appeared and been divulged. Because, boy, if you allow that out, end of truth embargo. And so my message to all of these heads of state of nations that know this is real at one level within their, or another in their government, you need to turn things around. You need to realize that you're sitting on the one thing that could possibly turn this ship in the right direction. And that if you don't do that, it's very clear where this thing is going. Now, this is a difficult and complicated message, but I'm now committed to getting it out as much as possible, in as many countries as possible, until one nation decides enough is enough. It's time for the world to know the truth. That, as we now know from all the new astronomy, that we're just one of billions of Earth-like planets in the galaxy. Oh, what a shock. Hell, I knew that when I was 15. And so they sort of know we really aren't alone. But wow, if they're already visiting us here now, we need to probably announce that. And that's where things stand.